It's so easy to think of English history as just starting with kings, castles, and sprawling empires, right? But the author of today's source material has this deep, lifelong fascination with British history. And honestly, it serves as a powerful reminder of how complex, layered, and just deeply compelling this island's past truly is. So today in this explainer, we're going way back to the very beginning. We're going to explore a simple but kind of mind-bending fact. England wasn't always called England.
Okay, let's dive into this and map out our journey. We'll start with the dawn of early humans, then take a march through the ages. After that, we'll ask, what's in a name, to uncover some forgotten titles. And finally, we'll explore the shift to England.
So our first stop, the dawn of early humans and the very origin of humanity in Britain.
800,000. I really want that massive number to just sink in for a second. When we think of British history, we usually jump straight to the Romans or the Tudors, right? But early human activity in present-day England actually spans over 800,000 incredible years. That is a staggering amount of time.
To be precise, archaeological finds at a specific site called Happisburgh in Norfolk give us some of the absolute oldest evidence of human presence in all of Northern Europe. We're literally looking at footprints and flint tools that date back roughly 840,000 to 950,000 years. It completely reframes how long hominins have been surviving on that particular patch of Earth.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the stark contrast in daily reality. At the very dawn of humanity, life was largely peaceful. And, not because early humans were inherently more virtuous, but entirely out of necessity. They lived in small bands with a super simple rhythm: hunt, eat, survive. There were no massive territories to defend, so there was no organized conflict. But as populations grew and those bands expanded, competition for resources ramped up. That early isolation gave way to rivalry, and this transition plants the very first roots of tribalism and eventually organized warfare.
All right, moving on to our next section, a march through the ages, from stone to kingdom. Looking at this vast timeline really puts everything into perspective. Walk through these eras with me. We start way back in the Paleolithic and Mesolithic eras with our hunter-gatherer communities. Then, bam, a massive technological leap in the Neolithic period brings farming and permanent settlements. Fast forward through the Bronze and Iron Ages, where we see trade, monuments like Stonehenge, and complex tribal societies building these massive hill forts. Then the Romans arrive in AD 43, forever altering the landscape with their administration. When they finally leave, we enter the Anglo-Saxon period, a chaotic time of competing kingdoms, which finally culminates in AD 927 when the unified Kingdom of England is actually born.
Which brings us to Section 3, What's in a Name? Let's unearth some of these ancient identities. First up is Albion. This is the absolute oldest recorded name for the island, popping up in ancient Greek and Roman writings. It likely derives from a Celtic word or the Latin word albus, which means white. It's a highly visual name, directly inspired by the literal first sight of the island's striking white chalk cliffs of Dover when approaching from continental Europe. Today, you're mostly only going to hear Albion used in a poetic or symbolic context. Next, we have Britannia, or Britain. This term was heavily used by the Romans after their conquest in 43 CE. It actually derives from Prudentii, or Prudeni, which was a term ancient Greek and Roman writers used for the island's inhabitants. Now, what's absolutely vital to remember here is that Britain heavily predates England as a geographic term, and it originally covered the entire island, meaning what is now England, Scotland, and Wales all combined. And the legacy of those ancient words didn't just vanish. Take Prydone. This is the native Welsh and Brittonic name for Britain. It shares the exact same linguistic root as Britannia, and it is just remarkably resilient. This ancient Celtic term survived the Romans, it survived the Anglo-Saxons, and is literally still actively used in the modern Welsh language today to describe the island. How cool is that?
But if Britain and Prydain meant the whole island, what did the native Celtic people call the specific territory that is today England? Well, they called it Logar. This native Brittonic name was used by the early Britons to draw a clear distinction between their own lands and the eastern and southern areas. And just like Prydain, Logar is still used in modern Welsh today when referring specifically to England.
That takes us to our final section, the shift to England and the birth of a unified kingdom. Let's watch how this final identity actually takes shape, because it's a very clear three-step evolution. First, in the early 5th century, the Roman Empire withdraws its administration. This creates a massive power vacuum, leading to the migration of Germanic tribes, specifically the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, from continental Europe.
Second, as these tribes settle the eastern and southern parts of the island, the territory they control gradually takes on a new identity. In Old English, Angloland, quite literally, the land of the Angles. Finally, over the 9th and 10th centuries, iconic rulers like King Alfred the Great and his grandson Ethelstan successfully unify these disparate tribal territories into one single cohesive kingdom.
So the crucial takeaway here is that by the 10th century, the transformation was complete. Engloland had become the standard accepted term. It wasn't just a geographical description anymore. It signified a powerful, unified Anglo-Saxon kingdom. And, importantly, it firmly established a distinct identity for England, entirely separate from its northern and western neighbors in Scotland and Wales, who obviously retained their own unique cultural and political identities.
It really makes you look at a map differently, doesn't it? The borders and names we take for granted today are really just the top layer of a very deep archaeological dig. From the 800,000-year-old footprints at Happisburgh to the White Cliffs of Albion to the tribal unifications of Engloland, the landscape has constantly been rewritten. It leaves us with a fascinating question. As you look at modern maps today, how many ancient names, forgotten tribes, and millennia of history are buried right beneath the very places you call home? It's definitely something to think about next time you walk out your front door. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.